Picture this. You are standing inside a stone church in the freezing heart of a Scottish winter. The year is 1306. The date is February 10th. Your breath fogs in the air. The altar candles throw trembling shadows across the flagstones. This is Grey Friars Kirk in Dumfries, a house of God, a place of sanctuary. And the two most powerful men in Scotland are about to settle an argument that no church wall was ever built to contain. Robert the Bruce stands across from John Comyn, called the Red for his copper hair and his copper temper. They have come here under a truce. Neutral ground. Holy ground. But the words between them have curdled into something beyond saving. Bruce accuses Comyn of the worst possible betrayal, leaking rebel plans directly to King Edward I of England. Comyn denies it. The denial only sharpens the blade of Bruce's fury. Words fail. Steel flashes. Bruce draws his dagger and drives it into Comyn's chest. The body collapses, bleeding out across the sacred flagstones. Bruce staggers out into the January air, blood on his hands, and finds his men waiting outside. His voice, when he speaks, is stripped of all the political calculation he had spent 20 years perfecting. "I doubt I've slain the Red Comyn," he says. Not a confession, but a shiver of disbelief at his own action. His lieutenant, Roger de Kirkpatrick, stars at him. Then he draws his own blade. "You doubt," he says. "I'll make sure." He walks back into the church and finishes the job. The sacrilege was complete. A man had been murdered on consecrated ground. Robert the Bruce was now excommunicated from the church. A wanted criminal in the eyes of God and every Christian king in Europe. By morning, he would not be a nobleman with a political problem. He would be a sacrilegious outlaw with a death sentence and a rapidly closing window of time. How did a man this calculated lose control so completely? And why did this murder, this act of desecration and panic, become the only available door to Scotland's freedom? The answer begins not in that church, but 20 years earlier, on a dark cliff above the sea, in the winter of 1286. King Alexander III of Scotland rode out into a storm against his advisers' council. He was in high spirits, newly remarried, eager to reach his young wife at Kinghorn Castle across the Firth of Forth. His horse lost its footing in the dark. In the morning, they found his body on the beach, his neck broken. His reign ended in a single moment of Scottish weather. He left behind no heir, no male line, no clear successor, and into that vacuum, 13 men with claims, some plausible, most absurd, began circling the empty throne like carrion birds over a battlefield. This chaos was called, with grim understatement, the Great Cause. The Scottish nobility, terrified of civil war, made the kind of catastrophic decision that looks reasonable right up until it destroys you. They invited Edward I of England, Longshanks, Hammer of the Welsh, the most ruthless sovereign in Christendom, to act as arbitrator, to pick the winner. Edward saw not a dispute to resolve, but a nation to devour. He marched his armies to the border, forced the Scots to acknowledge his overlordship, and selected John Balliol as king, not because Balliol had the strongest claim, but because Balliol was weak enough to manage. Scotland went from kingdom to client state almost overnight. The Bruce family watched this with barely contained fury. They had their own claim to the throne, arguably stronger than Balliol's. They refused to kneel easily. But kneeling, Bruce was learning, was sometimes the only way to survive long enough to stand again. When Balliol finally gathered enough spine to resist, forming an alliance with France, the famous Auld Alliance, in 1295, Edward's response was not political, it was surgical and savage. In the spring of 1296, his army sacked Berwick, then Scotland's wealthiest trading port. The slaughter lasted 3 days. Contemporary chronicles describe the streets running with blood, the bodies stacked in warehouses, the screams audible for miles. Thousands of civilians, merchant, women, children, were butchered within hours. Then Edward stripped Balliol of his royal insignia in a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, scratching the royal arms from his surcoat and earning Balliol his lasting nickname, Tomb Tabard. Empty coat, Scotland ceased to exist as a kingdom. It became an administered English territory, with English sheriffs, English taxes, and English soldiers quartered in Scottish castles. Robert the Bruce absorbed every lesson from this carnage the way a blade absorbs heat, quietly, completely, and with eventual consequence. He had watched Wallace rise in furious rebellion. He had watched Wallace get taken, tried in a London courtroom for treason against a king he had never sworn loyalty to, and then hanged, drawn, and quartered with a slow deliberateness designed to teach every Scotsman watching what the ceiling of ambition looked like. Bruce drew a different conclusion than most. Wallace had been a weapon. Weapons get used, and then they get broken. Bruce intended to be something else entirely. The hand that held the weapon. He played both sides with cold precision, serving Edward when survival demanded it, supporting the rebellion when opportunity allowed, always positioning himself closer to the crown without appearing to reach for it. He was not a hypocrite. He was a man who understood that an occupied country requires a different kind of courage than an open battlefield. The courage to swallow your pride and wait. By 1306. The waiting had a deadline. William Wallace was dead. Edward I was old and visibly sick, though still terrifyingly dangerous. And standing between Bruce and the throne was one man, John Comyn, connected to the old royal line, politically allied with the English, and constitutionally unable to let Bruce have Scotland without a fight. They had tried partnership. It had collapsed. They had tried negotiation. That had collapsed too. The meeting at Grey Friars was supposed to be a last attempt at resolution. Instead, it became the moment where 20 years of calculation were overridden by a single second of rage. Bruce came out of that church a changed man, not reformed, not broken, but clarified. The murder had slammed every door behind him except one. He had to move immediately. He had to claim the throne before the news reached London, before the English army could mobilise, before the momentum of the moment collapsed into the ash of another failed Scottish bid for freedom. He wiped Comyn's blood from his hands. Then he rode north for Scone. There is something almost unbearably human about a coronation held together with desperation and borrowed clothes. Robert the Bruce arrived at Scone in late March 1306, just weeks after the murder, riding hard against the clock. Scone was the ancient crowning place of Scottish kings, the hill where, by tradition, every monarch since Kenneth MacAlpin had been consecrated before the eyes of God and nobility. It was the right place. Everything else about what followed was wrong. The stone of destiny was gone. That sacred block of sandstone upon which every Scottish king had sat for centuries, the physical embodiment of royal legitimacy, had been stolen by Edward I a decade earlier. He had dragged it south to Westminster Abbey and installed it beneath his own coronation throne. A heavy, literal metaphor for what he had done to Scotland itself. Bruce could not sit upon it. He sat instead on a plain wooden chair, in a half-empty abbey, before a gathering that looked less like a royal court and more like the remnants of one. The royal robes were missing, locked away in English vaults or simply vanished in the chaos of occupation. He wore borrowed vestments that didn't quite fit across the shoulders. The crown itself was a rushed fabrication, gold melted down and hammered into a circle in a matter of days by hands that were working from memory rather than tradition. A coronation is theatre as much as ceremony, and every prop in this production was second-rate or absent entirely. But the most painful absence was the people. Scotland's great magnates stayed away. Earls and lords who might have filled the hall with the weight of noble legitimacy instead chose the safety of distance, unwilling to attach themselves to a sacrilegious murderer who might be dead within the month. The calculation was understandable. It was also cowardly, and it left Bruce's coronation looking less like the birth of a reign and more like a funeral with delusions. By ancient right, the privilege of placing the crown upon the new king's head belonged to the Macduff family, the Earls of Fife. The current Earl was a teenager, raised in England, loyal to Edward, and nowhere near Scone. The honour would go unperformed. And then, out of the grey Scottish morning, came the sound of hooves. Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan and sister to the absent Earl, had made a decision that defied every instinct of self-preservation a medieval noblewoman possessed. She had stolen her husband's finest war horses. He was a common ally, which made the theft both practical and pointed, and ridden hard through freezing countryside to reach Scone in time. She arrived breathless, mud-spattered, and entirely determined. Her family's right and her country's need had overridden everything else. She placed the golden circlet on Robert the Bruce's brow. It was a gesture of staggering personal courage. And she knew, even as she performed it, what it was likely to cost her. It would cost her everything. News of the coronation reached London like a lit fuse reaching powder. Edward I was 66 years old, ravaged by dysentery so severe that his attendants had to carry him in a litter from room to room. He had been dying by degrees for months, but the word from Scotland did something that medicine had failed to do. It revived him, not in body, in fury. What followed was one of the most theatrically extraordinary moments of medieval English kingship. At the Palace of Westminster, Edward convened a great feast. 2 swans were brought before the assembled court, adorned with golden nets, birds of purity and majesty, chosen deliberately for the solemnity of what came next, before his nobles, before God, and before those 2 bewildered birds. The old king swore a solemn oath. He would march north. He would punish the usurper Bruce. He would never sleep 2 nights in the same place until Scotland was ground beneath his heel. He then knighted his son, the future Edward II, along with nearly 300 other young nobles in a single ceremony, conjuring an instant army of aristocratic vengeance from a banquet hall. It was theatre, magnificent, calculated, terrifying theatre, but it was also entirely sincere. Then came the decree that stripped away any remaining illusion about the nature of what was coming. No quarter. Edward raised the dragon flag, a signal understood by every soldier in Christendom. The laws of chivalry were suspended. Prisoners would not be taken. Bruce was not an enemy combatant. He was a criminal. This was not war. It was extermination. Bruce, still operating on the assumptions of the world he had grown up in, made a catastrophic miscalculation. He fought like a king of the old order. In June 1306, he marched his small army to Perth, held by the English commander Aymer de Valence. Bruce arrived with knights in gleaming armour and banners snapping in the summer wind. He sent a herald to the gates with a formal challenge. Come out. Meet us on the field. Let honour decide the matter. De Valence looked down from the walls, assessed the situation with the eyes of a man who had not been raised on the same romantic notions, and replied that it was too late in the day for a battle. Tomorrow. They would fight tomorrow. Bruce accepted this at face value. He withdrew his forces several miles to the woods of Methven. The army made camp. Armour came off. Fires were lit. Dinner was being cooked. De Valence attacked at twilight. The English cavalry thundered out of Perth without ceremony, without warning, and without the slightest regard for the agreement that had been made. They caught the Scottish army in their shirts, reaching for swords in the chaos of firelight and screaming horses. What history records as the Battle of Methven was not a battle at all. It was a massacre of the unprepared. Bruce was unhorsed, dragged into the mud, and saved only by loyal knights who physically hauled him onto a stray mount and spurred him into the darkness. He fled. His army did not, or could not. The defeat was total. The psychological damage was worse than the military loss. Bruce had tried to be the king from the history books, fighting with honour, observing the codes, trusting in the rules of chivalrous warfare. De Valence had taught him, in a single evening, that those rules were a luxury belonging only to those who could afford to lose. What followed was swift and merciless. Bruce's wife Elizabeth, his daughter Marjorie, his sisters, and the brave Isabella Macduff who had crowned him were captured as they attempted to flee north. Edward's revenge was deliberately, grotesquely theatrical. He ordered the women locked in wooden cages, open to the weather, exposed to the jeers of passers-by, and hung from the outer walls of Roxburgh and Berwick castles. Isabella Macduff's cage was attached to the wall of Berwick Castle itself, displayed like a specimen, like a warning, like a trophy. She would remain there for years. The Countess of Buchan had placed a crown on a king's head. Edward ensured that every soul in Scotland who heard of her fate understood the price of such loyalty. By the autumn of 1306, Robert the Bruce was king of nothing but wind and heather. No army, no family, no castle, no crown worth the name. He was a fugitive moving through his own kingdom with a price on his head, hunted by English soldiers from the south and, perhaps more dangerously, by the relatives of the Red Comyn from the north, men who wanted blood for blood and had every reason to find him before the English did. The King of Summer had fallen. The long winter was only beginning. The winter of 1306 was not merely a season. It was a sentence. Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, by a borrowed crown and a blood-soaked altar, was now a scarecrow figure stumbling through the rain-lashed highlands with a handful of loyal men and the entirety of two nations hunting him. The English held the castles, the roads, the ports, but the wilderness held something the maps didn't mark, something that made the English army look almost manageable by comparison. The MacDougals. This is a detail that gets swallowed in the broad sweep of the English versus Scots narrative, reduced to a footnote when it deserves a chapter of its own. Scotland's wars of independence were never simply a clean story of patriotic resistance against foreign oppression. Underneath the national drama ran a vicious, personal blood feud. The MacDougall clan was bound by marriage to John Comyn, the man Bruce had gutted on a church floor. They had no interest in politics, in grand strategy, or in the fate of kingdoms. They wanted the man who killed their kinsman. They wanted him dead. When Bruce tried to slip westward toward the coast, the MacDougals were waiting at a narrow pass called Dalry, the King's Field, a name that would prove bitterly ironic. It was not a battle in any formal sense. It was an ambush and a choke point. Highlanders pouring down from the rocks above with the screaming. Close-quarter fury of men motivated by grief rather than strategy. Bruce was cut off from his men almost immediately. 3 attackers reached him simultaneously, one grabbing his bridle, one seizing his leg, a third lunging onto the horse's rump behind him. He survived through nothing more refined than brute strength and the animal instinct of a cornered man. He smashed the first attacker with his sword hilt, spurred his horse forward to trample the second, and threw the third from his back with a shrug of his shoulders that must have required the kind of desperate power only mortal fear can generate. But in the chaos of that struggle, a MacDougall hand shot out and tore his cloak away, pulling free a silver brooch as it went. The brooch of Lorne, a small, circular piece of jewellery, utterly unremarkable in any treasury, but it is still held today by the chief of Clan MacDougall, passed down through 7 centuries as a physical receipt. Proof of the day the King of Scots nearly died in the mud of a Highland pass, grabbed at and almost dragged down by men whose cousin he had killed in a church. Dalry was the final education. Bruce did something that would have been unthinkable for almost any other medieval leader, something that required more courage, in its way, than charging a line of English knights. He disbanded his army. He told his men to scatter, to disappear into the woods, the glens, the islands, to become invisible. He kept only a tiny handful of loyalists, among them the young James Douglas, a man who would become one of the most feared warriors in the British Isles, and they vanished into the landscape like smoke. They lived like wolves, raw meat, ditch water, no fire when the English were near, never the same ground twice. The Scottish king, who had feasted in great halls and negotiated with the crowned heads of Europe, was now sleeping in the rain and eating whatever his hands could find in the dark. The English commander Aymer de Valence escalated accordingly. He deployed sleuth hounds, bloodhounds trained specifically to track human scent across terrain that would defeat any human tracker. The chronicles from this period read less like history and more like a nightmare rendered in ink. One night, Bruce and his foster brother were alone when they heard it. The baying of hounds. Distant at first, then building, getting closer with the terrible, mechanical persistence of animals that do not tire and do not doubt. Bruce made a decision instantly. He told his foster brother to run in one direction while he ran in the other, hoping to split the pack, divide the scent, buy time with confusion. The hound did not split. It stayed locked on Bruce. He ran. He found a stream and waded into the freezing water, pushing upstream for hundreds of yards, a technique that washes scent from the air and leaves the dogs sniffing at nothing. Then he hauled himself up into the overhanging branches of a tree above the bank and went still. He pressed himself against the bark and held his breath as the soldiers passed beneath him, torches bobbing, the hound circling in confusion at the water's edge, sniffing the bewildered air. The King of Scotland was hiding in a tree like a frightened child. That image matters. It is easy to build statues of men. It is harder to remember that they were also human beings trembling in the dark, willing themselves invisible while death walked past below. By late 1306, the mainland had become untenable. Bruce took a boat and sailed west into the Atlantic mists. He vanished so completely that the English celebrated his death. The common allies relaxed. The hunting parties stood down. For 4 months, the world proceeded on the assumption that Robert the Bruce was finished. Some historians place him on Rathlin Island, off the coast of Ireland. Others argue the Hebrides, or contacts in Norway. The record goes silent, which is itself a kind of answer. Bruce had finally learned to disappear well enough that even posterity couldn't follow him. It was in this exile, stripped of his crown, his army, his family, his castles, and his dignity, that the most famous story attached to his name supposedly took shape. History has wrapped it in the soft packaging of a children's lesson. The lonely king in the cave, the spider trying to spin its web. It falls. It tries again. It falls again. Finally, on the 7th attempt, it succeeds. The lesson, we are told, is perseverance. Try again. That is a lesson for children who have never had to outwit an army. If Robert the Bruce actually watched a spider in that cold exile, and perhaps he did, because desperate men in dark places watch everything, he almost certainly saw something far more tactical than an inspirational parable. A spider does not challenge its prey to open combat. It does not line up opposite a hornet and demand a fair fight. It reads the terrain. It builds a structure that uses the enemy's own momentum against them. It waits with absolute patience for the moment when the prey is already entangled, already helpless. And only then does it move. The spider is the original practitioner of asymmetric warfare. Bruce emerged from that exile with a doctrine so foreign to medieval aristocratic culture that his own knights would struggle to accept it. He would never again fight a fair fight. He would attack at night and melt away before dawn. He would destroy his own castles rather than hand the English a base of operations. He would strike at supply lines rather than soldiers, at confidence rather than bodies. He would use the landscape as a weapon. In the 14th century, these were the tactics of brigands and outlaws, considered deeply dishonourable by the chivalric code that governed warfare among the nobility. Bruce no longer cared about honour. He had left honour bleeding on a church floor in Dumfries. He returned to the Scottish mainland in February 1307, landing near Turnberry with a small fleet and a company of hungry men. The English knew he was back within days. They could not find him. He moved through Galloway like a rumour, present everywhere, cornered nowhere. The first proof of the new doctrine came at Glentrool in April. De Valence marched a heavy English column into the glen to flush Bruce out. Confident that a man with no army could not hold ground against professional soldiers in open country, Bruce was not on open ground. He was above it. He had positioned his men on the steep wooded slopes flanking the valley floor, not with spears but with levers, wooden poles wedged beneath boulders the size of small houses, as the English columns snaked along the narrow path below, weighted down by armour and horses and the particular arrogance of men who expect to win. Bruce gave the signal. His men heaved. Tons of granite cascaded down the mountainside. The boulders didn't discriminate. They hit horses, men, supply carts, anything in the valley below. Before the dust had settled, Bruce's men were charging down the slope into the chaos, engaging at close quarters an enemy that was already broken. He had won with gravity, not numbers, not chivalry, not the codes of formal warfare. Gravity. But the greatest shift was not tactical, it was biological, and it arrived on July 7th, 1307, at a small village called Burgh by Sands, just within sight of the Scottish border. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, the man who had stolen the Stone of Destiny, caged Bruce's wife, and sworn before two swans to destroy Scotland, took his final breath. His dysentery had finally outpaced his hatred. He died still trying to reach Scotland, carried in a litter, too broken to ride but too consumed by fury to stop. His last orders were grotesque even by his own considerable standards. He commanded that his flesh be boiled from his bones and his skeleton carried at the head of the army until Scotland was conquered. His son, Edward II, ignored the request entirely. He buried his father with appropriate ceremony, turned the army around, and went home to London. The pressure on Bruce did not merely ease, it evaporated. The terrifying old shark was gone. What replaced him was a minnow wearing a crown, distracted, unpopular with his own nobles, and constitutionally unsuited to the grinding, relentless work of imperial conquest. Bruce looked at the board. For the first time since that dagger thrust in Grey Friars Kirk, the pieces were beginning to move in his direction. But before he could drive the English out of Scotland, he had a darker piece of business to attend to in the north. He was going to finish the Civil War, and he was going to do it with fire. There is a version of Robert the Bruce that history prefers to tell. The underdog king, the fugitive redeemed, the man who rose from nothing to forge a nation. It is a compelling story, and it is largely true, but it leaves something out. Something cold and deliberate and necessary that Bruce himself never apologized for. Because men who make the decisions he made rarely apologize. They simply move on to the next calculation. In 1308, his greatest threat was not the English army massing in the south. It was his own people in the north, the Comyn family, relatives of the man whose blood Bruce had left drying on a church floor, held the earldom of Buchan, a vast and wealthy territory in the northeast of Scotland stretching across rich farmlands and ancient forests. They were powerful, deeply connected, and burning with a grievance that had a name and a face. As long as they stood, Bruce was fighting two wars simultaneously. He could not press south against the English while northern knives were at his back. The math was brutally simple. The Comyns had to be destroyed, not merely defeated. Before Scotland could be saved, he turned his army northward, and then his body betrayed him. The chronicles are vague about what exactly struck Bruce down at this moment, which makes it somehow worse. An invisible enemy attacking a man whose visible enemies were already considerable. Some accounts suggest a heart seizure, the accumulated strain of 2 years of sleeping in the open and eating whatever the heather provided finally presenting its invoice. Others describe a wasting fever, the kind that hollows a man from the inside and leaves him shaking and skeletal. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating. Bruce lost the ability to walk. He could not hold a spoon. He lay wrapped in furs on a litter, a king reduced to dead weight, while news arrived that John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, cousin of the murdered Red Comyn, was marching his forces toward Inverurie, fully expecting to find a leaderless rabble that would scatter at the first sight of a Comyn banner. The scouts brought the report to Bruce's bedside. The Earl's army was close. The mood in the Scottish camp was the particular flavour of anxiety that comes from watching your king dissolve before your eyes while your enemy sharpens his swords. Bruce asked to be lifted from his bed. His knights refused. he insisted. There was, by all accounts, no room for argument in his voice, only the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who has decided. They lifted him. They brought his war horse, and because he could not trust his body to keep him in the saddle, they almost certainly tied him to it, bound their king upright onto his horse like a scarecrow stitched into place. A dying man performing the theatre of a living one. What happened next belongs to the stranger corners of military history. The sight of Bruce, pale, shaking, visibly barely alive, and yet mounted and moving toward the enemy, sent a shockwave through his own men that no speech could have manufactured. There is something about a man who should be lying down, choosing instead to ride, that bypasses rational thought entirely and strikes something older and deeper. His soldiers did not need to be roused. They were already roused. They surged forward with the kind of energy that comes not from confidence but from the refusal to let their king die alone. The effect on the Comyn forces was the precise opposite. They had marched to finish off a dying man. What they saw instead was a king armoured in sheer will, leading from the front of an army that looked suddenly and inexplicably ferocious. The Comyn lines broke. The battle at Inverurie dissolved into a rout before it had properly begun. The enemy scattering across the northeast countryside with Bruce's men in furious pursuit. He had won a battle he could not stand up to fight, but winning was not enough. Bruce understood, in the cold, architectural way that distinguished his thinking from lesser men, that a defeated enemy is merely a future enemy who has had time to recover. The Comyns had the land, the wealth, and the motivation to rebuild. They had relatives across Scotland and allies in England. Another year, another alliance, another army, and the problem would simply present itself again. He made a decision that no historian has ever fully sanitized, because it cannot be sanitized. He ordered the Hership of Buchan. Hership is an old Scots word. It means harrying, the systematic destruction of a territory. But the word does not quite carry the weight of what Bruce unleashed across the northeast of Scotland in the spring and summer of 1308. This was not the collateral damage of armies moving through farmland. It was a deliberate, methodical erasure, a policy rather than a rampage. Bruce's soldiers fanned out across the rich agricultural heartland of Aberdeenshire with specific instructions. Every village was burned, not the fighting men's quarters, not the castle outbuildings, but the villages themselves, the homes of farmers and craftsmen and their families. Every barn was torched, every granary, holding the grain that would feed the region through the following winter, was set alight. The livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, were slaughtered where they stood, and the carcasses were dragged to the wells and thrown in, poisoning the water sources that the survivors would need. The vast timber forests that represented generations of accumulated wealth and resources were set on fire, burning for days. The smoke visible from the sea. The goal was not punishment, it was prevention. Bruce was engineering a wasteland so absolute, so deliberately stripped of every resource that could sustain human life or military movement, that no common lord could ever again raise an army from this territory or tax its people to fund a rebellion. He was not burning farms. He was burning the future of a rival dynasty. The destruction was so thorough, so unprecedented in its deliberateness, that people across Scotland spoke of it in hushed tones for 50 years afterward. The Hership of Buchan did not fade quickly from memory the way battles do. It lodged itself in the collective consciousness of a region the way only true catastrophe does. Not as history, but as a wound. It is worth sitting with the full weight of what this means. Robert the Bruce, the man Scotland would eventually celebrate as its greatest king. The liberator, the hero of Bannockburn, engineered a famine against his own people. He made a calculated decision to condemn a significant portion of the Scottish population to starvation and displacement in order to secure the political conditions necessary to fight for Scottish independence. The survivors fled south into England or died in the smoking ruins of everything they had ever owned. Children went hungry in the wreckage of farms their grandparents had built. Communities that had existed for generations ceased to exist at all. He knew what he was doing. There is no evidence he agonized over it. There is every evidence he considered it necessary. This is not the kind of detail that ends up on shortbread tins. The common power base was not merely defeated at Inverurie. It was vaporized. The earldom of Buchan, once one of the wealthiest and most politically significant territories in Scotland, was reduced to ash and silence. The family that had stood as Bruce's most dangerous internal enemy simply ceased to be a coherent force. Those who survived had nothing left to fight with and nothing left to fight for. The North went quiet. Because the North was dead, Bruce turned south from the smoking landscape of Buchan with the particular focus of a man who has removed every obstacle behind him and can now see clearly to the horizon. He had unified Scotland, not through persuasion, not through the careful construction of political alliances, but through the application of sufficient violence in sufficient concentration to make the alternatives unthinkable. It was a brutal arithmetic. He had sacrificed the part to preserve the whole. Whether that bargain was just is a question that depends entirely on where you are standing in the northeast of Scotland in the summer of 1308. Whether you were a dispossessed farmer walking away from the smoking ruins of your village, or a beleaguered king who had just secured the northern flank of a nation that would not have survived another year of civil war alongside English occupation. History does not resolve that tension. It simply records what happened next. What happened next was that Bruce looked at his country, the castle still bristling with English garrisons, the border still contested, the crown still unrecognised by any European power, and began to plan the second phase of the war. He could not drive the English out with conventional siege warfare. He had no trebuchet, no siege towers, no months to spare starving out fortified walls. He had something they would never see coming. Men who had spent years living like wolves, moving in darkness, surviving on almost nothing, and capable of extraordinary violence delivered without warning. He was going to take Scotland back one impossible mission at a time. He was going to teach his captains to be thieves. A medieval castle was not merely a building. It was a statement written in stone, 30 feet thick, permanent, immovable. A declaration that said, "We are here, and there is nothing you can do about it." The English understood this perfectly. Their network of garrisoned fortresses across Scotland was as much psychological as military. As long as those walls stood, Scotland was occupied territory regardless of what happened in open fields. Bruce had no siege engines. What he had was James Douglas, the man English mothers would eventually use to frighten children into obedience, and fighters who had spent years learning to move through darkness without sound. He did not send them to besiege the castles. He sent them to burgle them. Roxburgh Castle fell on Shrove Tuesday. 1314. Douglas knew the garrison would be drinking. The last night of excess before Lent demanded restraint. He dressed 60 men in black cloaks, commissioned specially padded rope hooks that wouldn't clang against stone, and led his men crawling on hands and knees across the frosted field. A sentry peered down from the ramparts, squinting at the dark shapes moving slowly through the grass below. "Look," he told his companion. "The farmer has left his cattle out late." The cattle stood up and swarmed the walls. Edinburgh Castle fell by a different kind of audacity. Sitting atop a sheer volcanic plug, it was considered simply impregnable. Randolph found a former garrison soldier named William Francis who, years earlier, had discovered a terrifying goat path down the North Rock face, used regularly to visit a girl in the town below. On a moonless night, 30 men followed Francis up that cliff in complete darkness, one handhold at a time. Halfway up, a guard leaned over the parapet and hurled a stone into the abyss, shouting, "I see you!" Into the dark, Randolph's men pressed themselves into the rock face. Hearts hammering, the guard laughed. He had been joking with his companions, and walked away, with no idea whatsoever that 30 Scots were flattened against the cliff 6 feet beneath his boots. They finished the climb. Edinburgh fell that night. Then Bruce did something that baffled his own commanders. Every castle his men captured, he demolished. Walls levelled, wells filled, timber burned, A castle held by a small Scottish garrison was simply a trap waiting to be retaken. He refused to let the English use Scottish stone as anchors for reoccupation. He pulled the anchors up and threw them into the sea. By summer 1314, only Stirling remained, and then Edward Bruce, impulsive and chivalrous in equal measure, made a gentleman's agreement with the English governor: relieve the castle by midsummer or it surrenders. His brother was furious. 8 years of careful guerrilla warfare, deliberately avoiding the pitched battle where English numbers would be decisive, undone by one act of medieval courtesy. Edward II had no choice but to answer. He marched north with the largest army England had assembled in a generation, over 2,000 heavy cavalry and 15,000 infantry. A moving city of steel. Against this, Bruce could field perhaps 6,000 spearmen. By every conventional measure, the outcome was already written, but Bruce had chosen his ground with an architect's precision. The new park funneled the English advance. The Bannockburn blocked the flank. Across the approaches, his men had spent days digging concealed pits to snap the legs of charging horses, scattering caltrops, iron spikes that always land point up, across the field like a crop of steel thorns. Then, on the afternoon of June 23rd, something no planner could have scripted unfolded in front of both armies. A young English knight, Henry de Bohun, spotted Bruce riding alone along the Scottish line on a small grey palfrey, gold circlet on his helmet, carrying only a battle-axe. De Bohun saw glory. He lowered his lance, spurred his massive warhorse, and thundered across the field. Bruce sat motionless as the knight bore down on him. At the last possible instant, he sidestepped his nimble horse and swung his axe. The blade split de Bohun's helmet from crown to chin. The knight hit the ground dead before his horse stopped running. Bruce rode back to his furious commanders. They demanded to know why he had risked everything on a moment of madness. He looked at the shattered haft in his hand. "I have broken my good axe." That single blow won the battle before it properly began. Dawn on June 24th. The English army had spent the night cramped in marshy ground, standing in mud, sleepless and demoralised. A Scottish defector had crossed the lines the previous night with a message: "Attack at dawn, and the English will break." Bruce made the decision that separated him from every purely cautious general. He would attack. The Scots emerged from the tree line and knelt in prayer. Edward II, watching from a distance, asked if they begged for mercy. One advisor answered with a line that has survived 7 centuries: "They kneel. Sea-ray. But not to you." The English cavalry charged into the Scottish skiltrons, circular formations bristling with 12-foot pikes that cavalry simply could not break in a straight line. Horses were skewered. The Earl of Gloucester was killed almost immediately. Then the geography completed what the spears began. English rear ranks pressed into men who could not move, pinned between skiltrons at the front and the Bannockburn at the flank. Knights suffocated in their helmets. The English archers, their deadliest weapon, couldn't shoot without killing their own men. Then the Gillies Hill erupted. Camp followers, servant, priests, anyone who had travelled with the army, grabbed pots and sticks and charged down the slope screaming. To the panicked English, it looked like a second Scottish army arriving. Their nerves snapped entirely. Edward II fled the field, abandoning his shield and royal seal on the ground. The Bannockburn filled with bodies so densely that men could cross it dry by stepping on the fallen. Bruce stood on the field as the last resistance dissolved. He had won the battle, but England still refused to call him king. The Pope kept him excommunicated. The war would drag on for 14 more years. He had run out of enemies to kill. Now he needed the right words. Victory at Bannockburn should have ended it. In the version of history that gets carved into monuments and printed on shortbread tins, the English fled south and Scotland lived free forever after. But history is not a monument. It is a process. Grinding, exhausting, and indifferent to the dramatic logic of battles won. The war continued for 14 more years. Edward II refused to acknowledge Bruce as king. referring to him in official correspondence as Sir Robert, a deliberate, calculated insult, reducing the man who had destroyed his army to a mere knight with pretensions. The Pope maintained Bruce's excommunication, which meant that in the eyes of the Church, Scotland's king was a spiritual outcast, his soul forfeit, his kingdom under a cloud of divine disapproval that no military victory could lift. European powers watched and waited, unwilling to formally recognise a nation whose legitimacy remained contested by both England and Rome. Bruce understood with characteristic clarity that swords alone could not break this deadlock. You cannot kill a diplomatic problem. You cannot ambush an excommunication. He needed to expand the war beyond Scotland's borders and, ultimately, beyond the battlefield entirely. In 1315, he opened a second front. He sent his brother, Edward Bruce, to Ireland with a substantial army, the plan being nothing less than audacious: unite the Celtic peoples of Scotland, Ireland, and potentially Wales into a grand anti-English coalition that would stretch England's military capacity beyond breaking point. It was the kind of sweeping strategic vision that looks brilliant on a map and catastrophic on the ground. The timing could not have been worse. Europe was entering the Great Famine of 1315, a climate catastrophe driven by years of relentless rain that turned fields into swamps and rotted crops before they could be harvested. The cold summers and failed harvests would kill millions across the continent over the following decade. Into this landscape of desperate, starving people marched a Scottish army that had come to liberate Ireland but arrived instead as another mouth competing for food that no longer existed. The chronicles from this period are not history so much as horror. They describe soldiers digging up fresh graves to eat the corpses. In Ulster, accounts exist, written by contemporaries, not dramatists, of people consuming their own dead children to survive. The pan-Celtic dream that had looked so promising in Edinburgh dissolved in the mud of an Irish famine that showed no interest in the politics of liberation. Edward Bruce, never a man to let reality restrain his enthusiasm, pushed deeper into Ireland regardless. In 1318, at the Battle of Faughart, his luck and his army both ran out. He was defeated and killed, and the English, with a theatrical cruelty that suggests they understood the power of symbolism as well as Bruce did, had his body quartered. His head was salted in a bucket and sent to Edward II as a trophy. A king's brother, reduced to preserved meat, dispatched as a message. Bruce received the news and absorbed it the way he absorbed everything by now, not with visible grief, but with the quiet recalibration of a man adjusting his strategy. The Irish front was finished. The military options were narrowing. The path forward was no longer through the battlefield at all. It ran through a pen, across parchment, and into the papal court in Avignon. In April, 1312, Bruce summoned his nobles to Arbroath Abbey on the eastern coast of Scotland. What emerged from that gathering was a letter addressed to Pope John XXIII, a document that began as a diplomatic petition and became, almost despite itself, one of the most extraordinary political statements of the medieval world. The Declaration of Arbroath opened with the kind of elaborate flattery that medieval correspondence demanded, then launched into a retelling of Scottish history, stretching back through the mists of legend to ancient origins in Scythia and the Exodus itself. It was mythology deployed as argument, the past weaponized in service of the present. But then, buried in the elegant Latin, came the passages that no one had written before in quite this way. The declaration stated plainly that Robert the Bruce held his kingship not by divine right alone, not by conquest, not by the mere accident of birth, but because he had defended the freedom of his people. And then it dropped a clause that was nothing less than revolutionary for the 14th century. If Bruce himself were to surrender Scottish independence, if he were to agree to subordinate Scotland to the English crown, then the nobles of Scotland would remove him and choose another king in his place. A king who would do the job properly. Read that again slowly, because it is easy to miss how radical this is. In an age when kings routinely claimed their authority descended directly from God and was therefore beyond any human challenge, the Scottish nobles were asserting something that would not become mainstream political philosophy for another 4 centuries. They were saying that a king's legitimacy is conditional, that it derives from his service to the people rather than from divine appointment, that the people, represented here by the nobility, but the principle extends further, retain the right to withdraw their consent and replace a ruler who fails them. This was the contractual theory of monarchy, written in 1320, a century and a half before Machiavelli, and nearly 4.5 centuries before the American Declaration of Independence drew on similar ideas to justify a different revolution. And then came the lines that have outlasted everything: the castles, the battles, the kings, the centuries themselves. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor rich, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. The Pope was listening. The diplomatic ice, frozen solid since Comyn's blood had stained that church floor in 1306, began at last to crack. The process was slow and unglamorous, as diplomacy always is, but in 1324, the papacy formally recognised Bruce as King of Scots. 4 years later, in 1328, a beaten and financially exhausted England signed the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, formally renouncing all claims to Scottish sovereignty and recognising Robert the Bruce as the rightful king of an independent nation. It had taken 22 years from the murder in Grey Friars Kirk, 22 years of running through the heather, hiding in trees, burning farms, demolishing castles, and breaking English armies. The struggle was over. Bruce had done it. He had taken a kingdom that had been erased from the political map of Europe and written it back into existence through sheer, relentless, costly force of will. But the cost was written into his own body in a language that admitted no argument. By 1329, the man who had split a knight's helmet with a single axe blow at Bannockburn could not leave his bed. The mysterious illness that had stalked him for years, its precise nature still debated by historians, with leprosy, severe psoriasis, and the accumulated physical damage of decades of outdoor campaigning all proposed as candidates, had finally won the war his enemies never could. He lay at his manor at Cardross, shrunken inside the frame of a man who had once been physically formidable, too weak to stand, attended by servants and physicians who could do nothing useful. His mind, however, remained restlessly active, and his conscience, which had been accruing debt since February 1306, demanded a final accounting. Bruce had never been formally absolved for the murder of John Comyn on consecrated ground. He had spent his entire reign fighting Christians, English, Scottish, Irish, rather than fulfilling the crusading vow that every devout medieval king was expected to honour. He was a king who had saved his nation, but he was genuinely uncertain whether he had saved his soul. The distinction mattered enormously to a man of his era, and there is no reason to believe his concern was merely theatrical. He summoned James Douglas to his bedside. The two men had been through everything together: the starving winters in the heather, the ambushes in the dark glens, the impossible climbs and midnight raids, the carnage of Bannockburn, and the long, exhausting years of diplomacy that followed. If Bruce had a single person who had witnessed the full arc of what his life had actually been, as opposed to what history would eventually decide it meant, it was Douglas. Bruce made his final request. When he died, Douglas was to cut his heart from his chest, preserve it, place it in a silver casket, and carry it to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. If Bruce could not make the crusade in life, if his body had failed him and his kingdom had consumed the years he might have spent in holy pilgrimage, then at least his heart would make the journey. It was the theology of a desperate man trying to close accounts he was not sure he could afford to leave open. On June 7th, 1329, Robert the Bruce died at Cardross. He was 54 years old, though the chronicles suggest he looked considerably older, which, given what those 54 years had contained, requires no explanation. James Douglas, true to his word in the way that some men simply are, had the heart embalmed and sealed in a silver enamelled casket, which he wore on a chain around his neck. He gathered a company of knights and sailed from Scotland, with the casket resting against his chest like a second heartbeat. They never reached Jerusalem. In Spain, they paused to assist Alfonso VI of Castile in his campaign against the Moorish forces of Granada. The kind of detour that crusading knights considered entirely compatible with their broader mission. At the Battle of Teba, in August 1330, Douglas saw an opportunity and did what Douglas always did. He charged. He broke the enemy line and kept going, pushing too far forward, too fast, until he was cut off and surrounded by Moorish cavalry with no route back. In that moment, Douglas reportedly took the silver casket from around his neck. He swung it by its chain and hurled it forward into the mass of enemy soldiers, shouting words that have echoed through Scottish memory ever since. Now pass thou onward as thou wert wont, and Douglas will follow thee or die. He charged after his king's heart. He was cut down in the press of battle, dying the way he had always lived, moving forward, loudly, without reservation. The survivors recovered both Douglas's body and the silver casket from the battlefield. They brought them home to a Scotland that had not yet finished mourning its king. Douglas was buried at St. Media, Bride's Kirk in Douglas. Bruce's body lay under a grand marble tomb in Dunfermline Abbey, imported from Paris, a king's burial for a man who had spent years sleeping in the rain. His heart was buried separately. At Melrose Abbey in the borderlands he had spent his life defending. In 1921, a lead container was discovered beneath the abbey floor during excavations. It was reburied with ceremony. In 1998, it was found again, this time with care taken to examine it properly. The container held a human heart, embalmed with preserving herbs, enclosed in a way consistent with the 14th century and the accounts of Bruce's dying request. They reburied it a second time. Beneath a stone inscribed simply, "A noble heart may have no ease. If freedom fail, so how should we remember him?" History has done its best to make Robert the Bruce comfortable, to sand down the edges, soften the contradictions, and deliver him as a straightforward hero. The statues show him in noble poses. The films give him reluctance and sensitivity. The shortbread tins omit the church floor in Dumfries entirely. But the truth is far more compelling than the sanitized version, precisely because it refuses to resolve cleanly into heroism or villainy. Bruce was a man who murdered his rival on holy ground and then spent the rest of his life trying to justify it with results. He burned his own people's farms and poisoned their wells to secure his northern flank. He demolished the castles his men died taking because strategy demanded it. He changed sides whenever survival required it and called it patience. He was ruthless, calculating, and capable of a cold mathematical brutality that would be deeply uncomfortable to celebrate if it hadn't also, somehow, worked. Scotland did not need William Wallace twice. Wallace was a martyr, noble, inspiring, and dead. Martyrs light fires. They do not win wars. Scotland needed a survivor. It needed a man willing to make every ugly, compromising, soul-damaging decision that survival actually requires, and then keep making them, year after year, until the map of Europe had no choice but to acknowledge that Scotland existed. Bruce took a country that had been erased and wrote it back into existence. He proved that a king is not defined by the crown on his head but by the weight of what he was willing to carry and sacrifice to keep it there. The heart in the ground at Melrose says everything his statues cannot. It travelled further than the man. It ended up exactly where it belonged.